Fantastic. So
Great.
for the sake of the recording, 3 minutes, and then we'll go to initial calls. Thank you. Okay, we've had about 3 minutes, so we're going to go to initial calls now. We will do it in same order we introduced ourselves. So Diego, I'm going to ask you for your initial call first, if that's okay.
So for me, first goes closing government, second closing opposition, third opening opposition, and fourth opening government.
Okay, Ruth, what's your call?
I have closing opposition, opening opposition, closing government, and then opening government.
Okay, perhaps fortuitously, I have the call that is directly between the call that both of you have, which is the first going to closing opposition, the second going to closing government, the third to opening opposition, and the fourth to opening government. So we agree on opening government taking the fourth, so we will deprioritize that conversation. The two conversations we really need to have are the bottom half of the debate and the short diagonal between open opposition and closing government. I think let's focus on the first of those first, so the bottom half of the debate, and then we will move to the second one where we might need to spend a little bit longer because it's a little bit messy, I think. But the whole debate is a mess, so we'll see where we go. So the way this is going to work is we're going to start by talking about the bottom half of the debate. And the two of you do not agree here, so I'm going to start by asking you, Ruth, to explain why you think closing opposition is defeating closing government. In about 90 seconds, if you can. Then Diego, I'll go to you. You can push back, you can give your perspective, and then we'll see where we are. Okay, so Ruth, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So there are two main things for me here, likelihood of success, and outside of that, what the impacts are likely to be. What CG is able to do for me is to analyze how you're able to set a precedent to not only one, deter companies, but also the country as a whole. As to the extent to which that is effective in terms of companies that have excessive amount of leverage, it is unclear. What CEO then is able to do to me is show how, one, that amount of precedents you're going to set is not worth the impact in terms of economic issues that you're going to leave on these developing countries, since they are most likely going to be the targets. And two, even if you do have that precedent, there is still economic impacts that lead directly to the same outcomes that CG wants to solve by dealing with climate change, i.e., the economy crumbling, individuals dying, etc. In that regard, then, CEO is better able to show why there are alternatives that are likely to work without necessarily cutting down the economic effectivity of these countries, which is where I think they marginally take it above CG.
Okay, Jacob, do you want to push back on any of that or give your own perspective at all?
No, yeah, I like to see how we weighing some clashes. Firstly, on the principle side, I guess the principal justification on closing government it is not necessarily about the scope of resolving issues on a huge environmental level, but raising certain amount of awareness that is fair and to a certain degree explain that principle like something more plausible that the way of just having to repair or allowing certain developing countries to say that because they were harmed in the past, they now have the right to harm the environment. So for me, the weighing on the principal clash is a bit better on closing government. But secondly, on the alternative and the behavior of companies, I guess I'm a little bit unpersuaded to the degree of how much these companies are just abandoning these developing countries because they are just going to be such have such amount of fear of receiving the punishment of these sentences. I guess the analysis of deterrence on closing government explains to a certain degree that they change the behavior to not to pollute that huge amount, but not necessarily to just completely banish them from those countries. So I guess on the alternative on how these companies measure their risk, I'm a bit persuaded by the POI of the government whip, and I think that for me that's the main points. Those are the main points.
Okay, I'm quickly just going to push back on a couple of things. First of all, I just want to talk about how we're weighing the principled argument that's coming from closing government. I do agree that they levy a principled claim that there is a principled wrongdoing that is being done currently, and that principally we ought to care, therefore, about the right to have legal recourse to address these things, whether or not that legal recourse is successful. The problem is, I don't think that they justify it to be an imperative, i.e. that it is something that outweighs practical considerations in the debate. What they say is it's not contingent on those. What I don't think they do is say why it ought to outweigh those considerations and be more important than them. And I don't think we get a justification for why that ought to be true. Secondarily, I think there is an implicit response in the opposition whip speech that deals with this anyway, which is to say the basis of the wrongdoing and the reason closing government tell us we care about that principle is likewise also a consequence of the reasons we ought to care about the economic harms that they are able to justify. If we accept that response from closing opposition, if we think that is a reasonable enough response, and whilst it is a response to the practical side of the closing government case, it implicitly is also a response to the core of the principled analysis. If that's true, then it folds into the second clash of which team do we think is able to get the better practical outcome. And it's here that I do agree with Ruth, that I agree with you, Diego. I don't think that they necessarily prove that companies will act solely on the basis of this versus something else, but I do think they prove the existence of trade-offs in many of these cases that will lead to some form of economic harm. And I think they give us explicit weighing for why we ought to believe that is more important than the very marginal potential of harm, because it is so unlikely in many cases that there is a practical consequence long-term in terms of dealing with the environmental harms. So those would be my main concerns. At this point, we're a little bit tight on time. So Diego, do you want to push back? And then we'll give Ruth the last chance to say anything, and then we'll vote on this clash.
Just a quick response to the government whip weighing, which is saying that we are affecting a huge amount of citizens. This is a huge imperative. Maybe I'm giving too much credit to that. I don't know if you think that weighing is a bit assertive. If you think that maybe it's not as analyzed as required, maybe I could see that. And on the consequential side, I guess I can also consider.
Ruth, any final thoughts before we move into a vote?
Sure. So on the principle, I still think that CEO largely mitigates that by demonstrating how these companies and the countries themselves can have bargaining chips between them in terms of how much emission you can have, how much you can produce within their jurisdiction, while still not causing them economic harms. The second thing then would be on whether CG is able to prove that even if the prosecution is not successful, these companies are going to be more likely to behave like they want, which is to reduce their emissions, rather than be so scared that they don't, or they decide to not produce at all, which I think they don't do.
Sure. The one very quick thing I'd add, Diego, is I think the thing that Ruth said, the former of the 2 points, also does respond to your concern about the weighing, which is to say that whilst they do weigh on scale, I don't think we get to the point that they have proven impact that can then be scaled. Whereas I think closing opposition are able to sort of weigh that in the context of these whole countries and their economies to a comparable enough scale, even if it's not as much. But we are going to need to vote on this first clash now because we're very tight for time. So fine if you you're happy to concede it? You're with closing op now?
Yeah.
Okay. So at this point, we agree that the fourth has gone to opening government. We agree that the first has gone to closing opposition, presumably, unless anybody's changed their minds on anything there. The last question we need to resolve is the second and third between opening opposition and closing government, where Ruth, you think opening opposition has come second. Diego, you and I think that closing government has come second. So we're going to do the same thing again. This time, Ruth, I'm going to go to, I went to you first last time, Ruth. Diego, I'll go to you first this time. You say why you think closing government defeats opening opposition. In a minute, if you could summarize. Ruth, will go back to you very quickly, and then we'll see where we are.
Just very briefly, it's about framing. I think opening opposition cases based on getting these big outcomes of resolving issues of environment and telling that now we won't have a full cooperation or international alignment to fulfill this type of actions. I think when closing government frames the case of saying that maybe these actions are not going to be dissuading in that regard, they are just going to be a focus on awareness, and that the point of doing this is not necessarily having the huge outcome of resolving climate change or pollution, but giving other type of tools. I think that many of those material try to be not as persuasive to me, while it's reasonably proven. I don't think that they're actually giving the reasons to think that was the main point of the universal jurisdiction. So it's basically that.
Ruth, a minute to push back if you'd like to.
Sure. So this was the shaky clash for me. My issue here then was, Opening opposition is able to identify why these developing countries are more likely to care about their economies than climate change. Even if they do have an issue with wanting to solve climate change, they're going to prioritize their economies over it. What CG is unable to do for me then is to show one, best case scenario, external countries come in to prosecute these companies within these smaller countries. CG is unable to weigh for me how this in itself, if climate change becomes lessened within these countries, still benefits them, seeing as most of these countries largely depend on these corporations to be able to function. So that was the way in that was missing for me, while OO was still able to present some amount of cooperation between these countries, the smaller ones, and the corporations to be able to mitigate the effects of climate change.
Okay, so just to push back on that slightly, I think for me, this comes down to characterization, which is to say, I think closing government are able to disprove the characterization upon which opening opposition rely on to get to that trade-off about what developing countries' citizens might prefer in the first place, to the extent the government whip has quite a considerable breakdown of why it is unlikely to be the kinds of scenarios that opening opposition rely on via bullying is how it's described, but it's a large power prosecuting against smaller powers to their detriment. And whilst I think closing opposition will subsequently deal with that, which is why that is not a problem for them, in this clash specifically, I don't think open opposition have any kind of response or justification for why that ought to be the case, to the extent we would get to that. So I'm still with Diego, or with where Diego was. I don't know if Diego's been persuaded. At this point, we really need to push to it. So unless anybody has any pressing things, we are going to have to go to a vote, and it might be a split decision. Any final concerns? In which case, on the short diagonal clash between opening opposition and closing government, by a show of hands, who thinks that opening opposition has won that clash and therefore comes second in the debate? Ruth, who thinks that closing government has won that clash and therefore comes second? Okay, so it's on a 2-1 split for that. But I agree, it's a very close part of the debate. I think that's fine. I think they've both got things that they ought to have improved on. I'm going to make a note that that is a 2-1 split for the second, third. And then I am going to load up the speaker scale because we're going to do that now. We're not have time to discuss opening government, unfortunately, because we are at 15 minutes and we do need to do speaker scores. But I think probably we are unified in broadly thinking that they don't necessarily get to proving a lot of the impacts they claim. The characterization of the debate comes under heavy attack and is therefore, it makes it very difficult for them to sort of land their points against even opening opposition who come third in the majority call, who are able to take down a lot of what they say. Comparatively, closing government are doing more to prove the key elements of why we ought to care about this on a principle and practical level, and then closing opposition almost transitively for the same reasons that the other two teams might be beating them are a holistic composition of those two reasons also beating opening government. But we don't really have time to talk about that. If there are differences of opinion on what that is, I don't know, we can type it in the YouTube comments or whatever. We can have the argument there instead. For now, let's go to speaker scores. So starting in closing opposition, do we have a preference between the opposition whip and the opposition member?
I don't have a preference, but if I have to choose, I would go for whip.
I also don't have a preference, so I think we give them a pair. So I'll read you a bracket. You tell me if you think it is this bracket, above or below. The bracket I think is, I'll read you 2 brackets. You think it A, B, above or below. So bracket A, arguments address core issues of the debate, have strong explanations demanding strong response from other speakers in order to defeat them, may occasionally fail to fully respond to very well-made arguments, but flaws in speech are limited. Or bracket B, arguments relevant, address the core issues in the debate, well-made without obvious logical gaps, and are all well-explained, but may be vulnerable to good responses. So that's bracket A, bracket B, above or below. Thoughts from either of you?
I think bracket A. I think the analysis is quite nuanced, and maybe certain implicit responses that I was not followed were there, and I think that definitely makes them bracket A.
Ruth, what do you think?
Yeah, I would also go with bracket A below, not above, bracket A below.
Bracket
bracket
A was the higher of the 2 brackets.
Yeah, so I don't want to go to bracket B, but the bottom of A.
Bottom of A or top of B. So I think we'd be either looking at a pair of 83s or a pair of 82s here, because that's where that would put us. I am slightly leaning towards agreeing with Ruth here, and the reason why is I do think the main difference between these 2 brackets is about how vulnerable they are to responses. Is it good or a strong response that we need to take them down? I think there are a lot of issues with closing opposition to the extent that there are still vulnerabilities in the case. it would require a good level of justification to explain the nuances of the incentives, but I don't think we get to the point that it'll be a strong response. I think still a good response would, for the most part, take them down. So I'd say top of that bracket, a pair of 82s.
Sure.
Okay.
Thoughts? Diego, you happy? You're not happy?
Yeah, happy.
Happy, okay. So pair of 82s, moving into closing government preference here.
Preference for whip for me.
Whip, definitely whip.
I agree.
1 point.
And I'd say the whip is almost is probably as good as the two speakers in closing opposition, and probably also an 82.
Yeah.
And then how far down that bracket would we be going for? Remember, I still think the middle, or probably upper middle of the second bracket we read out before, so an 81.
Yeah,
Yes.
82, 81.
Okay. At this point, we're moving into opening opposition. Do we have a preference for the leader of opposition or the deputy leader of opposition?
Deputy leader of opposition, I think. Better.
I agree.
Yeah, Diego.
Do we think the deputy leader of opposition is as good as a member of government, or going down further than that?
I would go one step lower.
So we'd be moving down to an 80.
Yeah.
And then that would be a
Okay.
79 for the leader. Is that where we're going for this? Are we happy with that?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think that's fair. And I think although we identified closeness in the call, I don't think it's necessarily closeness in terms of speaks. I think in terms of where the speeches individually are evaluated, they do suffer from flaws. And whilst technically the tipping point into them taking a second is probably quite a marginal one, I don't think it needs to be reflected on speaks here. In opening government, do we have a preference for the Prime Minister or the Deputy Prime Minister?
I would go with
Okay.
DPM.
What do
I
you say,
think
Diego?
that they're even. I don't see that there's particularly better analysis on DPM. The DPM make just good rebuttal, but not necessarily better than Prime Minister.
I think that's probably fair. I'm inclined to agree. I think they're probably a pair, and I think they're not in the category we read out. I think we're moving below now into arguments almost exclusively relevant, address most core issues, occasionally but not often may slip into deficits and explanation, simplistic argumentation, vulnerable to competent responses to peripheral or relevant arguments, but clear enough to follow, and that's credit, which I think is reflective of kind of what happened, albeit that the analysis was strong, that points would have required good responses. They just ended up getting them. So I think probably top of that bracket, pair of 78s, maybe?
Yeah, fair enough.
Okay, in which case, what we have is call, and we have speaks, and it's almost exactly 20 minutes now, but just for the sake of clarity, I'm going to read out the results and everything. Mostly it's for the recording, so we have adjudicated this in 20 minutes, just so you know people watching, but I'm going to read it out anyway. So we said opening government, fourth, Prime Minister 78, Deputy Prime Minister 78, opening opposition on a 2-1 split coming third, Leader of Opposition 79, Deputy Leader of Opposition 80, closing government on a 2-1 split coming second, Member of Government 81, Government Whip 82, and closing opposition unanimously coming first with an 82 for the Member of Opposition and 82 for the Opposition Whip. Happy?
Yeah.
Great, fantastic. Let's stop recording and then we can go back through for the OA.